Welcome to Armory Live. It's my pleasure to introduce our first talk of the day, Creative Control, Criticism as Art and Art as Criticism. Interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art, so wrote Susan Sontag, one of America's most astute interpreters of art, and surely with a touch of irony. But is critical thinking really an enemy of the creative spirit, or is it precisely this friction that makes for a richer, more dynamic cultural landscape? This panel would address the necessity and also the limits of both art and criticism, and how the relationship between artist and critic has evolved over time. This discussion will be moderated by Jennifer Krasinski, Senior Editor at Artforum, and there will be some time at the end for some questions, but in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Jennifer and her panelists to the stage.
Welcome all of you, and thank you for coming. As Julia said, my name is Jennifer Krasinski. I'm a Senior Editor at Artforum, and it is absolutely my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon with these brilliant panelists, Carroll, Dunham, Tobi, Haslett, and Rhonda, Lieberman. Now, generally speaking, the practices of art and criticism are perceived as opposing forces, or at least criticism is often misunderstood as running counter to art's interests. But if it's in fact true that art and criticism are, and have always been, inextricably entwined, each able to perform most fully and most powerfully only when in balance with the other. So in today's conversation with these brilliant people, before we'll discuss the dynamics between these disciplines and hopefully bringing into focus why each is so necessary to the vibrancy and health of both visual and literary culture, as well as intellectual life. And let me please introduce first Carroll Dunham, also known as Tip, is likely best known to you as an artist of paintings, drawings, and prints that have been described as optically electric visions of pre-lapsarian bliss, also joyous, sweet, and raunchy, that might be my favorite. His work has been exhibited globally, most locally here at Barbara Gladstone. He's had a career retrospective at the New Museum in the past few years, and many other museums too many to mention across the world. And what most people don't realize is that Tip has actually been writing about art for decades too, much of which can be found in this beautiful volume, Into Words, the selected writings of Carroll Dunham, which was published by Badlands Unlimited, which is the imprint of fellow artist Paul Chan. And in the introduction, Scott Rothkopf, who's a chief curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art, said, and I quote, "Tip's years of living, looking, and making underpin the depth of insight, feeling, and generosity that surges through the pages of this book." Rhonda Lieberman's words have appeared in Artforum, to which she contributed a brilliant column titled Glamour Rooms for many years, as well as The Village Voice and others. As an artist, her work has been exhibited at the New Museum and the Jewish Museum as well, to name only two venues. And she's also been a prolific and influential teacher in the MFA programs at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, and has served as a critic in sculpture at Yale University. And also, Rhonda, her work has been collected in the Rhonda Lieberman Reader, which is a collection of her singular essays as well as some of her fabulous course syllabi, also recently published by Pep Talk Reader. And Rhonda has been described by fellow critic Gary Indiana, and I quote, as one of the shrewdest, funniest diagnosticians of contemporary American writing today. Tobi Haslett here in the middle. His essays on film and literature can be found in +1, The New Yorker, and Artforum. His most recent contribution to the magazine of record is a gorgeous serif monograph piece titled A Philosophy of the Cauterized Room, The Art of Ukulele, which can be found in our March issue. And although currently in his third year of graduate studies in the English department at Yale University, Tobi has already distinguished himself as one of the most highly respected critics working today, having earned a reputation not only as an unerring eye and mind on culture, but as well a thrilling stylist. It is my absolute pleasure. I'm not only a colleague of these three, but a deep fan, and so thank you all for coming. And just a bit about the panel. We'll chat for about 45 minutes. Then we'll open it up to Q&A, which we hope that you will participate. And then afterwards, Tip and Rhonda will be doing a signing, book signing at the Artforum booth. I'll let you know where that is at the end, and please join us. Tobi and I will be sitting there chatting too. So we're welcoming you to continue the conversation then. Anyway, we'll get started now. So, let's begin at the beginning. I want to know how all three of you got into this business of art writing. And Tip, I'll start with you because, as I mentioned, you're the person here that most people associate as a visual artist, and probably fewer people know about your writing practice. So, when did you go to the dark side, Tip? Who are we to blame for this?
I had been an artist for, I don't know, over 15 years. I read a lot of, like we all did and do, read a lot of criticism and wrote notes to myself in journals and things like that. And I reached a point where I thought I needed some other way to be with art besides just alone in my studio making it. And I also wanted, I guess my work had become more public. I was more of a sort of, it was becoming my job, as it were, which is what one hopes will happen. But it also puts you in a different relationship to art in certain ways. And I wanted to have an activity where I needed to think about art that had no real direct relationship to the career aspect of what I was doing, for lack of a better word. And I guess I thought it was something that maybe I could do, and I wanted to be somewhat serious about it. It was your magazine that I blamed, because I was friendly with people there, and back when Jack Mankowski was the editor, he started to he had a sense that maybe I would be receptive, and he kind of asked me to start doing things. And it all went from there.
It all fell apart from there?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Rhonda, how about you? You also have a background in visual art, or initially you did, but you as well, you had scholarly, as a scholar.
Well, I always was on, I was trying to ride two horses with one behind. Studio, practice, and literature. I was an English major and a studio major, and then when I went to grad school, I thought if I combined that, you get art history, which is completely wrong. So I wound up, after 1 year, doing basically, to cut it to the chase, my own melange of cultural studies and literature, but I'm really mostly inspired by literature. And I really, the thing about writing about art, which is what I call it, not art writing, is because I see myself as a writer who happens to write about art a lot, and Artforum was a key enabler for me since I was a student. When I was a grad student, it was like the height of the Pomo era, and I was lip-syncing a paper on lip-syncing. It was very meta, very Pomo, and Night saw me and met him, and then the rest is, tragic comic history, because, when you're a grad student and someone pays you to write, it gives you an outlet, and the great thing about Artforum was that Artforum really has allowed me to experiment however I want, which has really suited me because I've never really stayed in my lane in a disciplinary fashion. And when you go to a graduate program in the humanities, you're really disciplined to stay in your lane, and that never was really amenable to me. So, to move on to the next question, really, or to anticipate, the writers who've inspired me have always been writers who have not stayed in their lane. And maybe I should just
I'm going to
move on from there.
Yeah, no. I want to get back to that question because it's actually it's an interesting one, and it's terrifically important to answer. But Tobi, just very quickly, you and art writing, because you actually come from a literary background, and yet you have wound your way into visual culture now. We got you.
I don't mean to flatter myself, but I think I have a lot in common with Rhonda Lieberman, at least in this respect. I would say that, not that I have any real expertise, but what I write most often about is literature, and I got into writing about art because of a weird historical material accident, because I wanted to write about the filmmaker Hito Steyerl, who, because of the collapse of the studio system and the fact that nonfiction film basically can't find funding outside of the gallery system. Her work is now classed as contemporary art. In a previous era, it just would have been called experimental film. So I started writing mostly about nonfiction film for Artforum, and then I guess the siren song was irresistible, and I started writing about things that, according to a more restricted definition, are called art. But mostly it was through film, my interest in nonfiction and experimental film. To give a very short, glib answer.
That wasn't glib. And brevity is, the way of this form. So, but let's actually get to Rhonda's question, or to Rhonda's point about who are you all reading? Because I do find that, who are your model critics or writers who you thought, oh wait, this interests me, this I can do. And because whenever I ask this question of writers, it's almost never my local art reviewer. It actually points to all of these different writers. So Rhonda, since you brought it up, I'll start with you.
You'll have to stop me because it's really hard for me to boil that down.
I sat
here just with my short list took up the front of a page, so I'm probably not going to make it through it. But just to preface it, I think, first of all, it wasn't art writers, it wasn't art critics. I was always drawn to good writing, and, present company accepted, good writing, I wouldn't go to art writing really necessarily to look for good writing. Those are the exceptions, and I treasure them. I treasure these exceptions. They exist, but they're, over time, I think I was drawn to always like a kind of belletristic and personal approach. Like critics who wrote from a personal approach were the people who I would look to and kind of check in with for vibes, and for points of view, and for attitude, and for tone. Like writers like Nietzsche and Proust and Oscar Wilde was hugely important. He explicitly writes about the critic as artist, and he just has incredible insights about it. Critic is self-portraiture, how the act of criticism is creating a new work of art on its own. It's your encounter with the prior work of art, and your response to it is its own creative thing. And taking seriously that, writing about art or within the art context on that level. Writers like Tom Wolfe and, again, Proust, on status anxiety and self-consciousness and how they go through a pretension and idolatry. They implicate themselves on the scene of interpretation. Janet Malcolm, how she foregrounds the scene of reading and interpretation, and she inserts herself there. I love writing that does that, because you have to be part of the picture if you're actually responding to it. You have to use yourself as an instrument, I believe. Like, I'm not interested in something that's impersonal or depersonalized. If something comes from an objective place, I don't really think it's going to be that engaging. So that's everything I said can be taken with a big grain of salt, because it's like fodder for a lot of debate, but that's a short answer.
Right, and Tip, what about you? I mean, you must have been reading art critics or art writers, but who were your touchstones when you finally sat down to write?
Well, I was just trying to think about that. There are two different ways I would talk about it, I guess. One is that I was aware from my early days following the art scene that there were artists who were writing. And more typical than my trajectory was that artists would tend to write when they were young, before they were becoming known for their work. I mean, and in a way sort of paved the way for their own, I don't want to say ideology, for their own sensibility and point of view. Donald Judd was like that, Mel Bachner was like that. There was an artist who's not much thought about these days named Bruce Boyce, who wrote in Artforum in the early 70s. It's very important to me. But I guess of American artists who have written it with some regularity, Fairfield Porter is kind of the gold standard to me.
Why is that? Why Porter?
Well, because his interests seem to bear no particular relationship to his own art, because he was very clear in his writing and erudite without being obscure. I think he was generous to artists in a way that other artists can be. See, I don't think I'm a critic. I know I'm not a critic. So I'm here under false pretenses in a way.
And that's why I wanted you here.
But you know, I mean, I'm kind of a drug addict whose addiction is books. You know, I read all the time. So I can't even say. Something I've figured out from doing my own writing is that language is a sort of parallel universe. You will never get it exactly right, but that's kind of part of what's beautiful about it. So I could say that having read Faulkner when I was a young person opened up possibilities about language to me that I think I could trace in my own writing. But I didn't know that. I didn't sit down and think, I'm going to do for art criticism what William Faulkner did for fiction. You know, it's just that I know that's in there. But, you know, I can also say that I'm very influenced by reading shitty science fiction. I don't think it's any of those things specifically. It's just words. I love language, and I love trying to find a way for my relationship to language to feel like it lines up with what I feel about artwork.
And Tobi, you, language, visual, visual
Yes.
culture. Well, you know, it's the same question, but maybe now moved on to, you know, maybe we move on to this idea of translating a visual experience into language. And is this something, I mean, you began with moving image work you were just talking about. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about sort of along what tips sort of brought into the room, which is it is a kind of strange translation job in certain ways.
I mean, interestingly enough, I'd say that the kind of work that I initially started writing about that could be classed as art writing was actually itself preoccupied with the question of translation from the visual into the linguistic. I mean, I had an early formative encounter with the work of Chris Marker. I think that in ways that I am still trying to handle or expunge, I think that left a kind of indelible mark on my entire orientation towards everything, towards writing about images, but also probably lent me a kind of secondhand political sensibility that I should probably grow out of imminently. But I do think that the question of how you translate visual material into language invites a lot of political questions as well. When you look at an art object, which is also a commodity, the way that you choose to describe it motions towards several different parties that have colluded to create and present that object. And I have a sense that we will be talking a bit more about this very soon, but
We can talk about it now. I mean, if you know.
yeah, I mean, I'm sure I will regret this, but I don't know, I try to remember when I'm writing about anything, and especially when I'm writing about art, that it is important for me, Tobi Haslett, to maintain some sort of political fidelity to the project of dismantling capitalism. I know that that won't occur because I'm writing in a glossy magazine. The most I can hope for is probably some slight futile reorientation of the reader's sensibilities. And I pride myself on knowing that most people don't even get that. So when I think about what it actually means to translate visual material into linguistic material, I recognize that that's also, in part, an ideological process. And I don't say that as a way to deride it, but more as an invitation to kind of inject it with your own sensibility, your own thoughts about the world, and to be reflexive about the way that you have been taught or taught yourself to interpret things. Sorry, that was a much more abstract answer, but I think maybe my point is that it's abstract.
No, but that's brilliant, and it brings up the question of, for lack of a better word, a sort of writerly allegiance. Like when you are translating, let's say, a work of art into writing, however it's happening, are you three thinking about, where is your allegiance? Are you thinking about the artist primarily, the work primarily, your own position within that? And it's a very, it's an endless question, but I'd love to get some thoughts. Rhonda, I'll start with you.
Take the allegiance put aside,
Please
because
do.
it's way more, and things are way more fluid than that, you need to, and you have to say something, exactly, like good fodder for conversation. I think when I write about art or in the art context, again, it's always about my encounter with the art object and the context. And I think I can't isolate the object with some kind of critical tongues from its social and cultural and all that baggage as well, and it also, which also includes its own style, its own aesthetic thing. But there's a lot of stuff going on when you're encountering an art object. Ideological underpinnings of various parties, the commodity structure of the marketplace, all those things. They're all kind of, they're vying for primacy, and I think it's, I like to kind of write about all of that, all of the mishmash, all the stuff, the power plays, all that stuff. It doesn't mean that I don't look at the text within its own frame and the way it was intended to be presented, but it's also always within a context that I encounter when I'm encountering the piece.
And Tib, how about you? Since you're not the critic on the panel today.
Yeah, so I hear. I suppose I think mostly about the person whose art I'm writing about reading what I've written, and wanting them to. I think what I want is to write with a depth and a focus about work I find important, that is approached in a way I wish my work would be approached. I mean, it's a sort of do unto others thing.
So sort of corrective is maybe not the correct word, but you're role modeling a kind of approach that, as you say, you wish maybe more writers and critics would have?
Well, I mean, I hear all this. There's nothing that either of my friends here have said that I wouldn't agree with in some way, but I think my remit is very narrow. I don't think I'm a writer. I think I'm an artist who writes, and I think that puts me in. And I'm also not a kid, which means I've seen a lot of things. I've looked at a lot of art. I've lived through a lot of iterations of the so-called art world, and I think that gives me a perspective that's not unique. I mean, David Sally and I are the same age. He's a very active writer. He and I have talked about this. I think it gives you a point of view that's different from others, and that there's a kind of freedom in that. I just write about things I like, and I try to explain why I like them.
I would agree with that. Just a general, stance to, point of view, writing about what you respond to. Occasionally I will write about something I hate because I think it's worth sorting that out and sharing that.
I'm waiting for that. I want to write about something I hate, but I still haven't found anything I hate enough to want to write.
Oh, well, that's pretty good. You're doing pretty well then.
What is that decisive moment of I mean, I think all of us, well, not Tips just said he hasn't, but the three of us have definitely written negatively about experiences with different cultural experiences. And how would you describe that moment where you decide, and hate is not the right word, but this I need to say something about that people will perhaps perceive as negative, and where do you find that fuel? So Tobi, I'll start with you.
What do you mean by fuel?
Yeah.
Or what's...
So I'll say it another way. I was having a conversation with Melissa Anderson, who's a film critic, and she was saying that when she likes a film, it's very easy to write about. When she dislikes a film, it's also very easy to write about because she has opinions immediately and ideas to share. It's when she feels nothing that the point of writing just falls away. And so I'm just wondering, in choosing your subjects, what sort of dynamic or energy or electricity or lack thereof, how would you describe that?
I completely agree with. I completely agree with Tip that there is an element of devotion that perhaps went under-articulated in my response to your initial question. That ultimately, in creating something out of language that is a monument to your own interpretation and a monument to your own sensory response, it's a deeply sensory and sensuous activity, and I think it's important to be reflexive about the way that that sensory activity actually interacts with the world. I would say that in the cases when I've written negative reviews, the examples that float to mind most immediately, I mean, that really are, they're never actually as mean as I want them to be. An editor always intervenes, or I become too embarrassed. But when I have actually critiqued a cultural object in kind of unambiguous terms, I realize it's been in biographies, reviews of biographies. I reviewed a biography of Diana Trilling, I reviewed a biography of Elaine Locke, and I sensed that there was something about the way that a life was being written that was somehow false. I mean, in both cases, they were biographies of writers, and to be kind of boringly specific here, I know your question is much broader.
No. Specifics always answer
in these specific examples, I thought that in the case of Diana Trilling, who is the critic associated with the New York intellectuals and the wife of Lionel Trilling, obviously a totemic figure in mid-century American intellectual culture, I thought that the book, in its attempt to basically dignify her life as a person who deserved to be considered alongside her husband, actually didn't delve deeply enough into her writing. And I remember having to make a kind of calculated choice as to how I was going to do the oddly redundant thing of being critical of this critic's criticism of a critic. And I was just like, yeah, no, it didn't work. And I actually, that situation is exactly the one I was in when I was writing about Elaine Locke as well. So in a funny way, often the objects that I find myself reviewing poorly, or maybe this indicates something about my kind of under-articulated critical sensibility. If something rings somehow hollow, and especially if it's a portraiture of any kind, and I think that its description of how life is lived is leaving out certain core elements in what I perhaps naively understand to be what it's like to be a human being, I feel the need to stand up and say something. I won't pretend it's a particularly heroic act, but now that you ask me that, I realize that's the thing that spurs me to write negatively.
No, but I would say that that's actually something that goes misinterpreted about negative criticism, is it actually oftentimes as a reader or as an editor, I find, and as a writer, it's about sort of pursuing a certain falsity or a certain sort of, Rhonda, you do this, and particularly in your work, no, sorry, you have written actually incredibly astutely about, say, the sort of theater of the art world, for example, or certain falsities as you see them, and yes, and now I hand the mic to you.
Back to influences, most of my idols are really experts at skewering pretension, and that's one thing that I really enjoy reading, because it's just, it's like a tonic, it's like a reality check, when you see these kind of overinflated figures kind of swanning around, why not have someone come and say, well, what's really going on here? And also, it motors the art world in so many ways. The puffing up of reputations and posturing and status anxiety and conspicuous consumption and all that. So most of my favorite writers were obsessed with that and connoisseurs of that. And I'm humbled by them, but I'm definitely inspired. And I guess going back to negative things, which I don't think I've done, I guess I'm making myself sound really negative up here. I don't think I've written many explicitly negative pieces, but they were always punching up. They were never punching down. I believe that sacred cows could afford to be criticized. I would never criticize like a young person or embarrass a student or anything. And the other thing I wanted to say was that for me, criticism in a kind of teaching context at a crit, I think I'm a little more generous and willing to go over and go the extra mile to the intention of the artist for a student crit. than I would be in a professional piece of writing that I'm publishing, because I feel more that this is my thing and I'm going to just, reflect my own point of view here very much, and I will, of course, be interested in the artist's, intention and where they're coming from, but I'm not necessarily their nanny, Whereas when one's teaching, one wants to be supportive and facilitating, and to kind of build on strength more and not necessarily focus on any, the weaker spots.
But let's bring the quote that I chose. Interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art. And of course, I'm taking this out of context from Sontag's Against Interpretation, but I do think it hits on still a kind of mistaken understanding of the relationship between criticism and art. That one is an intellectual pursuit and the other is sort of creative and therefore perhaps more spirited and soulful. And Tip, I'll start with you, just in terms of, as somebody who's practicing both, do you feel like these two practices come from very different parts of your brain? Or at least maybe in the process? Do the processes sort of, are they different?
Well, they definitely come from different parts of one's brain, but there are a lot of crisscrossing. It's more braided than that.
Synapses are kind of doing this?
Well, I mean, if I were going to give a really seriously one-line description of how artwork functions, it would probably be something about nonverbal communication. However, everything is sort of swimming in a sea of language all the time. The only way we really know what we're interested in or what, as a community, we're supporting is if we talk to each other about it. So, forget art writing, the whole possibility for a work of art to mean something is rooted in language, even though it is very important for young artists to realize they don't have to be able to explain themselves. Like, I don't know why I did this, I felt like it, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that language isn't in some way what's supporting all of it. It's a very complicated and mysterious relationship, and if you take on the task of writing about visual art, that doesn't give, it's one thing to write about, I don't know, a Barbara Kruger or a Lawrence Weiner or something like that. It's something else to write about things that are made with human hands but have subject matter. It's something else yet again. This sort of goes to Tobi's ideological framing of the whole problem. There are different things that play vis-a-vis language, depending on the kind of thing you're writing about. So, I don't think intellect, to me that Susan Sontag quote is, that's just sort of a cute one-liner at a cocktail party. I don't think a lot about stuff like that. The visual culture in this larger culture is incredibly rich, but it needs language in order to mean anything.
Tobi?
I admire certain aspects of Susan Sontag's career. Others I don't particularly care for. I think that this particular essay is interesting because it's advice that she never took herself.
Well, precisely, right? Yeah.
Obviously. It would never occur to me to use the word revenge to describe the relation between the intellect and the art object. The fact that I wouldn't use that language makes me want to reflect on why she chose it, and I think that maybe what she's trying to capture in a tendentious or overly chic way is the dynamic relationship between criticism and art, which is not what you're saying to a certain degree. Maybe I'm misinterpreting you. But when I think of that particular problem of the fact that criticism actually, it can act upon art. I think that's the point of the statement. It's not that criticism has to be some sort of, passive towel that you wipe art down with. But criticism sometimes, a rifle pointed at art. I think that's the kind of extremity that she's trying to drive us towards, so that we don't think of intellectual activity as basically futile or weak. And maybe this will lay my own ideological cards on the table in a blunt, rude fashion, but I was recently rereading, I'm going to regret this, I was recently rereading Adorno's essay on cultural criticism, and it's, in some ways, an essay that makes its argument very plain, which is that, people who call themselves cultural critics, they make the mistake of thinking that there is something called culture. That something that they call culture, they presumably stand above and can criticize from their Olympian heights, and what they're ultimately trying to do is make sure that the bad things are called bad and the good things are called good, so that only the good things can be admitted to that thing we call culture. And Adorno's whole point, on a very facile level, is that obviously the critic is part of that culture, that the class of the critic, the class of the people who read the critic, the ideological presuppositions that are both affirmed and denied by the criticism that you're reading, all of that is part of this whole cultural mass. I mean, what Marxists would call the totality, I'm sorry. But Adorno was a self-lacerating Marxist, but also ultimately an aesthete. And there's a really beautiful part at the end of that essay, which is all about, the dialectic between description and the kind of blunt opacity of the art object. And it's just like, you have to be as immanent as possible. You need to come as close and as close and as close and as close and as close as you can come to the art object. But you can't go too close. Otherwise you disappear into what he calls the abyss of the object. And I couldn't actually tell you exactly what he's talking about. I'm sure that on a certain level he couldn't, because he tried and it didn't really work. But I think about that often, how it's important to have a sensuous kind of appreciation, to be overwhelmed by the art object, but it's still an abyss, and that it's important to inflict a little bit of your sensibility on it to establish what Adorno in a different essay, I'm so sorry, called like the hair's breadth distance from the object. And then maybe I don't achieve that, but I think it's a worthwhile goal. And it's a fun line to have in your head as you do something difficult.
Well, this distance between self and the object, or self and the subject, is an interesting one. And Rhonda, it brings up a conversation you and I actually had off stage at some point about, criticism has, over time, in certain corners, eroded into a service industry for the art world. And you and I were talking about this vis-a-vis style, right, and form. And I guess I was telling you a story about another film critic, I'll bring you to the room, A.S. Hamra, who decided many years ago that he was very tired of having his reviews blurbed, and so therefore his criticism was being used by the industry without any pay or without any regard for the labor that it took. So he determined to begin writing criticism that was unblurbable, that could not be used for anything else but the form itself. And we were just at a party having this conversation, and I kind of wanted to continue it, not in front of all these lovely people, about deciding on form. And you have a very particular presence, this gets back to some of your, the writers who were talking about before.
Right, like going back to stuff I was saying about voice, tone, feeling and thinking at once, making the reader feel and think, and as a writer, feeling and thinking. I think that kind of grabs people and says, hello, we're kind of having experiences here, we're thinking, we're feeling, we're not just kind of making a transaction. And I think when writing is instrumentalized to validate a commodity, it's just it's reduced to a kind of a transactional kind of, gift wrap or something. Gift meaning, it's free, but it's free from the workers giving it for free, usually next to free. But, because I was thinking as you were quoting Hamra, I hadn't as my mind until now, but hearing you say that anecdote again, I was thinking, well, or they could pay him for blurbs, then maybe he'd be full of blurbs. Maybe he'd be writing aphorisms that could be, circulated, and put into big ads everywhere, So,
and you'd be writing ad copy.
Yeah, or, if he did it his way, he'd say, this is what I'm going to put in circulation, yes, it's true.
Forms.
Well, that brings up other forces, because ad copy, of course, that's a different relationship to writing, right? Because you're writing for a client under very constrained circumstances, and there's also a dialectic. Can you interrupt that? Can you play with that? Can you spin that? But, you know, most often one can't do that much. But all of this is, you know, grist for the mill. This is like the quandary of the writer. This is the position.
I want to take the last, I guess, 5 to 10 minutes that we have for us to be talking, getting to this point of voice. And I've chosen sentences, sort of favorite passages of mine from certain of your essays. And I want to kind of throw them back to you and ask you a little bit more about what's there. And Tip, I'll start with you, and because you have actually already touched on the subject of these couple of lines that I've taken from your essay, Land, from 1998, and I read it out loud. We analyze art with languages that do not reciprocally translate. The formal, the psychological, the historical, the religious, a long list of tools looped in a helix, and final readings don't count. The power of the world rubs against inner vision, and the friction generates pictures. I thought that was very beautiful. And I wanted to, maybe we can start again with this idea of language, visual, if art is the sort of non-verbal, and language being the verbal, and this friction producing.
Well, the thing you're quoting from was actually something I wrote about my own work.
Mm-hmm.
So it was performing a particularly odd function, I guess, which is my trying to be verbal about my own nonverbal communication. So in a way, and it's a very short, I wouldn't even call it an essay, it's a text really. And it was my kind of ruminating about what does it even mean to try to put into words something about things I've already made. And I've thought a lot about this over time, how there really is no finally correct way to talk about artwork. And maybe it seems quaint to have religion be in that list, except that historically and culturally, what we call religion is probably the primary driver of what we call art. It's extremely out of fashion to the point of becoming embarrassing to start laying some kind of allegedly spiritual map onto contemporary art. But we are allowed to talk about politics, economics, philosophical values, whatever. And I think all of these in the end are useful and valid ways of trying to unpack something which has no final answer. And this notion of friction, for me as a person who's making things, is this kind of, well, I'm interested in this and I care about that, and I think that person's work is great, and I think that person's work is shit, and somehow, you know, I'm trying to understand my own place in history. What does it even mean to be an artist in this place, in this time? And I don't know what other word to use but friction for all of the different tensions and anxieties that those different thoughts and possibilities that those different thoughts can open up. So.
And that friction seems necessary, yes?
I don't think it's necessary or unnecessary. I just think it's a condition of existence.
I like the way you bring up the open-endedness of any one ending point for interpretation, you know, in a piece of writing or, you know, a reading. I think interpretations are occasions for new interpretations. So it's good, I think, to bring up the open-endedness.
Yeah,
It's not the final.
And we're all in a very weird place as a people living in this particular civilization at this particular time. Like, you can do interpretation of interpretation of interpretation infinitely. So one is also left with the simple fact of what one feels. And I think that that's also a place that someone who's looking to have a voice as a writer has to trust that. You know, that's why I keep coming back to the fact that I write about things I believe are good. But all that really means is that I like them. I can find a use for them.
can I quote Oscar Wilde here, because it's always good. He says, "What is the highest criticism but the record of one's soul?" He says that criticism is self-portraiture of the critic, really. That doesn't mean that it isn't also an attempt to portray the work. Like if you take a portraitist doing a portrait of a person, you're trying to portray the person, but it by default is also a self-portrait.
It's always about you.
Yes, so he says...
It can never not be about you.
Right, and that's big because he says the record of one's soul more fascinating than history as it is concerned simply with oneself.
Which brings me to your quote, Rhonda.
Oh.
I know, I'm going to selfie you. I'm selfie. No, this is a passage that I love from Rhonda's. It's from a section titled "Wanna Being" from the essay "The Loser Thing." This is from 1992. And Rhonda, this is your life, right? Who has never felt flabby and shabby compared to a sleek, glistening commodity? Rigorously speaking, no one wants to be subject to the gaze. We all want to be fabulous objects. Late this century, the lines between wanting to have, wanting to be, and wanting to seem like a commodity have gotten hopelessly collapsed. Under the combined misery complex of capital and fame, abjection, the plight of those who are insufficiently recognizable as commodities, for commodities, by commodities, is a national and personal emergency.
Well, that was written in 1992 when I was 5 years old. but I was very precocious.
But of course, like, you know, part of what caught my eye when I was rereading all of you and kind of deciding what to bring in is how prescient. And prescience is always a funny thing to lob at a writer.
This is pre-internet.
Well, exactly. So how do you see this
before
now?
the internet?
How do you see this condition now? Because it not only has not evaporated, it wasn't a passing thing, it actually is intensified.
Well, for me personally, after years of analysis, I've succeeded in embracing being a subject and not trying to be an object, or a better object, although I'd like to have firmer skin. I feel like, you know, so the personal journey and the broader culture are maybe at odds here, you know, and I guess if I could leave it at that.
You can leave it wherever you like. This is writers after all. You get to say the end whenever you want. That leaves Tobi. Tobi, this is from your essay, Blasted, on Reza Abdo's Tight White Right. And towards the end of your essay, you admit, or you say, right, quote, "I have never seen Tight Right White and never will. The work is not in circulation. It cannot deface the currency. I feel locked out of my own feelings because AIDS took Abdo away. There are scripts and bleary videos of Tight White Right BS, but they muffle the blast of the thing they seek to save. The hunger and hurt of this dead man's play lie at an elaborate remove now from who and what I am, my bouquet of identities and tastes, but whatever that is owed something to what he did. He can madden and offend me, transfix and perplex me, but he eludes me." And the reason I bring this into the room is because you've written so beautifully about a work of art and have responded so beautifully to a work of art in this essay that you could not actually see. And it's a very interesting conundrum, I think, as a writer, and I wanted to hear you talk more about that, perhaps.
A bit of explanation might be
Sorry.
necessary.
Context would be nice. Thank you.
So I wrote a piece for the catalog for the show that is now at KW Berlin, but was at MoMA PS1 this summer, on the theater director Reza Abdo, an Iranian-American theater director who died of AIDS at 35. He left specific instructions that his work could not be performed without him, which means that when he died at an unusually young age from AIDS-related complications, that basically his work was lost forever. So, in a sense, the show that I was writing about, the show that's currently up in Berlin, is a profoundly and inevitably melancholic object. It's documentation, and not especially technically satisfying documentation at that. It's very shaky, bleary video of what was once a live, very immediate, sensorially overstimulated performance, and it's been reduced to, video, not even film grain with its kind of voluptuous connotation, but truly just the kind of bloodless, electronic aspect that we associate with, VHS. And so I was writing about this work that I could not have seen because I could not have attended any showing of this now infamous play. And it was interesting to write about it because I recognized that Adorno's warning about the abyss of the object actually could not apply to my situation. I couldn't disappear into what I'm sure was an overwhelming experience because it was put at this remove. And you kind of have to ask yourself, why is it at this remove? I mean, you can't actually talk about what it's like to watch Reza Abdo's work in 2019 without talking about the legacy of AIDS, and in ways that I didn't think were necessary to make totally explicit or to inflate into some sort of plangent but rather obvious point. The very act of observation, the very scene of criticism was crossed with just the tremendous hurt and loss of the AIDS crisis. And so there I was, thrown back onto my own helplessness in front of not even an aesthetic object, but a record of that object. And I was just like, what am I in 2019? Whoever or whatever I am probably has some vague relation to this person who was a non-white gay man who died of AIDS in 1993, I think it was. And so that's kind of what I was getting at. That just, for all the kind of my pretensions to be a kind of intellectual conquistador in a Sontagian way, plunging at art, that there was a way in which it could repel me. And the way that it repelled me, it felt political, it felt material, and ultimately I was just kind of left to wander around in my own feelings about it. That's what that sentence is about.
That's beautiful. I'd like to open it up now for all of you to join in the conversation, questions or answers you might have. Yes, and there's a microphone coming to you, sir.
Well, you mentioned that when you write criticism of a work, it's really about yourself, and that's a very admirable confession. But we also talk about the viewer creating the work. I'm sure you're familiar with that dialogue, which is hitting the ping pong ball back. And then, when you put these two together, the sum is that you're the educator. You're let's say one version of the ideal viewer. And you're offering that to the reader, who then can go look at the work and benefit from your experience in life as well as with the work. So I don't want you to be unfair to yourself.
That's very generous, thank you.
Hi, thank you for talking to us. I was wondering, a lot of what we talked about for criticism was in the form of writing and language, and what your ideas were on criticism in other forms, I guess. So either as artists, through pastiche or reference, or in like documentaries or records, critiquing.
Well, in so many ways, I mean, another Oscar point, art is a criticism as well of prior texts. It's not only that, but a lot of art is a response to a prior text, and by doing it in a different way or stylizing it in a different way, emphasizing different things, that in a sense is a critical stance toward a prior text, even though it's not the end-all critique. But I think there's much more of a kind of a fluidity between criticism and a creative text or creative piece of work. A painting could be critical not even verbally, but in terms of the way it's painted, right? I mean, you have so much art that's influenced by art, and it could be seen as a kind of criticism in the positive way.
I mean, do you think of your painting as responsive to, in the same way that criticism is, or in an analogous way?
Well, it's highly responsive, but I don't think I would use the word criticism as to sort of explain that function or that way that artwork is embedded in a continuum of other artwork. It's, I mean, I am like many contemporary people working as artists today, pretty well educated on the history of Western art, very appreciative but quite ignorant about the history of other cultures, and also keenly aware that it's 2019 in the United States. I think of every painting as a kind of hypothesis about what painting might be. So I don't think of it as, I suppose it's critical in the sense that I'm choosing, you know, to paint this way rather than that way. But I don't think about it as criticism. I think about it as setting up a hypothetical, like this might be a painting. Oh wait, it is a painting. I don't think that's criticism exactly, but that's painting as a self-aware, self-referential activity, definitely.
I just want to chime in and modify by saying I was introducing a broader idea of criticism to open one's mind
Oh
to
yeah,
that
but
criticism.
he used the word.
I think the kind of garden variety idea about criticism is there's this expert standing from on high and deeming something doomed and not something else saved, and you know, picking apart things like American Idol or something. And I think criticism is a lot richer than that. It's, you know, it's reading, it's a response, it's a response to the text.
Unfortunately, we all, I mean, how old was I when my mother said to me, why you hate being criticized? Like, I mean, I hate being criticized. And, you know, that probably happened 60 years ago. So it's a word that is loaded.
Sure, yes, definitely.
And, you know, here it is, critics, criticism, blah, 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 it's all over the place here. And I'm just, since I know I'm not an art critic, I'm trying to just step away from this whole paradigm a little bit.
Well, I'll step forward
But I get it 100%. Oh yeah.
Not
No,
because
no.
I think I don't like the way it's positioned in the world just and circulates as a kind of good housekeeping seal of approval for the product, you know. But I do think that I often, you know, I love criticism. Well, it's when it's done well. I find it, you know, exciting and illuminating. And I feel like so often we could, you know, accept the garden variety way the term is thrown around in popular culture or whatever, and
Everybody's a critic.
yeah, exactly. You know, well, everybody you know about.
Everybody's a TV critic. Everyone I know is a TV critic, myself included.
Right.
Criticism, it should also be said, has grown increasingly toothless in the past few decades. I mean, negative reviews have been a focus of our panel, or maybe the only panel in the world that actually cares to talk about that.
Well, that's a great point.
Yeah, the word itself is very loaded, but the actual practice has been completely disemboweled.
Well, they
by
probably
commodity
spend a lot.
culture.
People who have put a lot of time and money into producing a Broadway show that dies after 2 days because of horrible reviews probably talk a lot about criticism.
Well, that's
You know, but it has a different power and a different agency in the context of art, I think.
In different media, I think it reflects different.
You know, because you mentioned earlier, like, I forget how you put it, the criticism as a sort of service industry or something. I mean,
yeah.
there is that, and I think about that too, because I've written things for galleries, for catalogs that they produce. I quite enjoy that relationship of artist, art dealer, and me. You know, I like that. But I'm also well aware that I'm, in a way, I might, you know, you could, from a certain jaundiced viewpoint, you could see that as writing text for, you know, annual reports for corporations. I mean,
I think what Jennifer was referring to is people writing kind of like 800-word glorified press releases. That's different from writing a catalog essay.
Yeah,
I think we all love catalog essays.
I'm sort of turning it into a little bit of a cartoon just to make a point, but yeah, of course.
But it is funny. I think there's a conversation with critics about it's almost harder to write in praise of art because the language of praise has been so co-opted by the press release and so forth. So how do you formally or
just read any like 12-year-old kid's book review? It's just, you know, this is a great book. I love this book.
Right. How about another question? Interrupt us, please. Yes, sir, in the back.
At the risk of sounding disingenuous, I have to say, my three favorite contributors to Artforum are also holding microphones. And I think one of the reasons... well, she's one of my favorite editors. I find it impossible to separate any of you from what you write when you write about art. And I think that gives it a character and a quality that for me is very genuine. And I would just ask this very simple question of all of you, since I like what you do so much, who do you seek out, present company excluded, when you get an issue of Artforum? What makes you want to crack the binding and read that first?
Just to read your name.
Well, you mean you look for yourself? No, really, who do you like to read? Who in your mind represents really excellent, point of view when it comes to writing about art?
Should we be generous and open it up to beyond Artforum and maybe just say,
Absolutely.
who are your favorite art writers, art critics?
I can do an Artforum name. At the risk of also sounding disingenuous, my friend and occasional editor David Velasco is somebody whose writing I tremendously appreciate precisely because his sensibility is diametrically opposed to mine in many ways. And I don't say that even in a barbed way at all, but actually I find that especially in the pieces like the current piece on Paul Pagasipuya, and I think most heroically in his book-length study of Sarah Michelson, he devotes himself to his own devotion, and he ends up constructing these really compelling mythologies surrounding the artists. I mean, his goal in writing, and I'm sorry to be kind of taking the words out of his mouth or smashing them to bits, but his goal is actually to construct a mythos and to, basically build a small altar to these people who seize his attention. He doesn't feel the need to demystify, very reasonably so. We live in a thoroughly demystified world. But yeah, I think that his is a critical practice that I always find very compelling, probably for the exact reason that it's not the move that I find myself making very often.
I don't really have an answer.
Nobody you like?
No, it's not bad. It's just, it's like, are there any artists I like? Are there any writers I like? It's too big. Also, I kind of go by subjects more than I do by writers. My favorite person writing about art right now is another artist called Alexi Worth. And I don't know that Alexi has contributed to Artforum. So that's another conversation, Charles. But yeah.
Rhonda, what draws you, if not to a particular writer, but when you choose to read, say, contemporary criticism, what draws your attention?
Well, I'm going to say something really awful and honest. I don't really read a lot of contemporary writing about art, and I feel like I'd rather construct my own. I sound like a kind of a...
I don't either, honestly.
Yeah, like I do have favorite things I've read about art that are usually from another time, because I always feel like I can sort out where I'm at now in relation to a different context. I can see my present when I look at something different, because it shows me what I'm in that becomes a little invisible, But I think my all-time favorite book about art is James Lord's Giacometti Portrait. I've read it so many times, I just love it to death. It is funny and aesthetic, and James Lord sits for a portrait by his friend Giacometti, and he writes about the process of sitting for the portrait, and he kind of, he didn't tell Giacometti he was doing it at the time, so he went home, he scribbled down notes every night, and what emerges is this amazing portrait of Giacometti at work, and his process and his doubts and his, muttering nervously and all this stuff, and it is one of the most useful accounts of making a work of art that I've read. So I just love that. I love that piece.
I want to thank you three for being here this afternoon. I want to thank you all. It was a real pleasure to meet you. Again, please join us for the book signing at the Artforum booth, which is booth number
A2.
A2.
Right? It's literally outside.
Thank you all so much. It was an honor.
And thanks to Jennifer also for putting together such a